My name is Mara, and for 7 years I lived inside a world most people only brush against in half-serious jokes and candlelit curiosity. It was not the pretty version you see on social media feeds or the theatrical kind whispered about in spooky podcasts. It was quiet, disciplined, personal, and deeply real. Early mornings when the streets were still asleep, evenings that smelled like smoke and melted wax, notebooks filled with symbols that only made sense to me, and a constant awareness that everything I thought, said, and felt was shaping something unseen but very present around me. I did not stumble into it out of rebellion or boredom. I entered because I was searching for control over my life when it felt like nothing else would listen to me. And witchcraft, in its most honest form, promised exactly that. Not magic tricks, not shortcuts, but an intimate relationship with intention, repetition, and the invisible architecture of cause and effect. It taught me to slow down before speaking, to measure my words as if they were ingredients, to notice patterns that most people overlook, and to understand that what you consistently name becomes what you eventually live inside. At first, it felt empowering. I learned to sit with silence. I learned to focus my thoughts until they stopped wandering. I learned to write my fears down and burn the paper, to speak affirmations over water before drinking it, to set intentions before sleeping. I watched coincidences stack on top of each other until they stopped feeling accidental. But what changed me most wasn't what I gained. It was what I witnessed. I saw how people talked about themselves when they thought no one was listening. I saw how often they joked about their pain, their loneliness, their failures, and their futures without realizing that their nervous systems were listening even when no one else was. I saw how quickly repeated phrases hardened into beliefs, and how beliefs quietly sculpted the decisions people made without them ever noticing. It became impossible to unsee. Once you recognize that your mind treats repetition as instruction, you can't pretend your words are harmless anymore. I began noticing that certain sentences carried weight far beyond their syllables. People would laugh them off, throw them into conversation, post them as captions, repeat them like punchlines. And then months later, they would sit across from me wondering why their lives felt stuck in the exact shape of what they had been joking about. They would say things like they were destined to be alone, or that chaos followed them everywhere, or that nothing ever worked out for them, and their lives would slowly arrange themselves around those declarations, like furniture being placed into a room that had already been labeled. They didn't know they were labeling their rooms. They thought they were just talking. When I finally left that world, it wasn't because I stopped believing in it. It was because I had learned enough to understand that the most powerful rituals people perform aren't done in secret circles. They are done casually, publicly, repeatedly, and without awareness. They are done in car rides, in group chats, in late-night jokes, in frustrated sighs, and in throwaway comments that feel meaningless in the moment. And once I stepped away, I realized how often I heard the same phrases everywhere, like a quiet chorus people didn't know they were singing, a chorus that was shaping their expectations, their reactions, and their futures long before anything actually happened to them. That is why I am speaking now, not to frighten anyone, but to interrupt something that has been running on autopilot for far too long, because there are certain things people say that don't just describe their lives, they quietly design them. And most people don't realize they're building anything at all until they look up one day and find themselves living inside the very sentences they once laughed about. I used to say it with a laugh that sounded light but landed heavy inside my chest, usually after a disappointing date or a long night of scrolling through other people's wedding photos, the words slipping out like a shrug, "I'm going to end up alone," as if I were commenting on the weather instead of quietly narrating my future. At first it felt harmless, even comforting, because it softened the sting of rejection and made loneliness feel like a punchline instead of a wound. But repetition has a strange way of turning jokes into expectations, and expectations into quiet agreements. Each time I said it, my body reacted before my mind did. A subtle tightening in my shoulders, a familiar sinking in my stomach, a tired acceptance that crept into the way I looked at new connections. I started pulling back faster, leaving earlier, responding slower, and excusing emotional distance as self-protection rather than recognizing it as rehearsal. Without realizing it, I was practicing being alone. My nervous system was learning that solitude was the default, that closeness was temporary, that hope should be kept small so disappointment would hurt less. I wasn't just saying the words, I was training myself to live as if they were already true. And the world, being deeply responsive to what we consistently prepare for, began mirroring that training. Opportunities passed quietly. Promising connections faded more easily than they should have. I noticed how often I declined invitations, how quickly I assumed disinterest, how rarely I allowed myself to be fully seen. It felt safer to expect emptiness than to risk wanting something more. Over time, the joke stopped sounding like a joke and started feeling like a script I was following without realizing I'd memorized it. I saw the same pattern in others: friends who called themselves unlovable, people who laughed about being emotionally unavailable, women who introduced themselves as always single, as if it were a personality trait instead of a temporary season. They weren't just describing their lives, they were defining the boundaries of what they allowed themselves to hope for. When you repeat a sentence long enough, your mind stops questioning it. It becomes familiar, and familiarity feels like truth. Your posture changes, your tone changes, your choices change. You stop leaning forward into possibility and start leaning back into prediction. Even your eyes carry a different story, one that says, "Don't stay too long, this won't last, I already know how this ends." And the strange thing is, life often agrees with whatever ending you expect most consistently. Not because it is cruel, but because your behavior quietly arranges your reality to match your inner script. By the time I noticed what I had been doing, I could feel how deeply the sentence had settled into me. Like a piece of furniture that had been in the room so long, I forgot it had ever been moved in. It wasn't just something I said anymore, it had become something I lived, something my body recognized, something my choices obeyed. And all of it began with a joke that didn't feel serious enough to question. This one usually slipped out when I felt overwhelmed, when the sink was full of dishes, my inbox was overflowing, my heart was tired, and my plans weren't lining up the way I hoped they would. I'd laugh softly, shake my head, and say my life is a mess, as if it were an honest self-assessment rather than a powerful declaration. It sounded realistic, grounded, even humble. But slowly, that sentence became the lens through which I saw everything. My mind started scanning for proof that it was true. Unfinished tasks stood out more than completed ones. Small mistakes felt larger than steady progress. And moments of calm were dismissed as temporary flukes rather than signs of stability. I began narrating my days through the language of disorder, labeling my circumstances as chaotic even when they were simply busy, calling my emotions broken even when they were just tender, treating normal seasons of transition as personal failures. The words started to reshape my perception, and my perception quietly reshaped my behavior. I procrastinated more easily because what was the point of organizing a mess? I delayed decisions because chaos had become the story I believed about myself. I underestimated my own resilience, overlooked my growth, and spoke about my life as if it were something happening to me rather than something I was actively participating in. What startled me most was how comfortable that identity became. There is a strange safety in labeling your life as a mess. It lowers expectations, gives you an excuse to stay stuck, and creates a familiar emotional atmosphere that feels easier to inhabit than uncertainty. I noticed how often I used the phrase to deflect deeper questions. When someone asked how I was really doing, I would smile and shrug it off with that one sentence, closing the door on vulnerability while reinforcing the story that I was barely holding things together. Over time, I began to see how deeply language can anchor emotional states. The more I described my life as chaotic, the more my nervous system stayed in a low-level state of stress, scanning for problems even in peaceful moments. Relaxation felt unfamiliar. Stability felt temporary. My body was living inside a story of constant disruption, and it behaved accordingly. Shallow breaths, restless sleep, difficulty settling into stillness. I wasn't simply experiencing disorder, I was rehearsing it. I saw it mirrored in people around me, friends who introduced themselves as always overwhelmed, co-workers who joked about never having it together, families who repeated the same tired narratives about being unlucky or dysfunctional. Their lives seemed to orbit the stories they told, not because fate was cruel, but because their attention, choices, and emotional responses were being guided by those stories. Once you define your life as a mess, you stop looking for elegance, for quiet victories, for gentle progress. You stop noticing how many things are actually working. You miss the evidence that you are capable, adapting, and growing. The sentence becomes a quiet permission slip to stay scattered, to remain unsure, to avoid restructuring what could be gently improved. And slowly, subtly, your days begin to arrange themselves around that label until you can't tell whether your life feels messy because it truly is, or because you've been teaching yourself to see it that way all along. People said this one with a smile, usually stretched out for dramatic effect, like a playful confession rather than anything meaningful. I'd sell my soul for a week off. I'd sell my soul for clear skin. I'd sell my soul for a little peace and quiet. It sounded harmless, theatrical, a way to emphasize desire without sounding needy. I said it too, back when I still treated my words like background noise instead of blueprints. But over time, I began to notice how differently my body responded to this phrase compared to others. There was a strange tightening in my chest when I said it, a subtle seriousness beneath the joke, as if something inside me was taking the sentence more literally than I intended. The words framed longing as a transaction, turning desire into a bargain, relief into a price, peace into something that had to be paid for rather than cultivated. And slowly, that framing began to shape how I approached my own wants. I stopped believing I could receive good things gently. I started assuming that everything I wanted would require sacrifice, exhaustion, compromise, or self-abandonment. Wanting became associated with loss rather than expansion, and my choices followed that pattern. I overworked myself for small rewards. I tolerated relationships that drained me because I believed closeness required giving up parts of myself. I stayed in situations longer than I should have because I quietly believed that nothing good came without a cost that hurt. I saw how this language subtly taught people to devalue their own well-being. When you joke about selling your soul, you imply that your peace, your time, your health, your joy are currencies rather than necessities. You frame burnout as normal, rest as indulgent, and happiness as something you must earn through suffering. Over time, your nervous system internalizes that message. It stops expecting gentleness. It prepares for strain. It becomes suspicious of ease. Even when something good arrives, it waits for the hidden bill that must follow. And that anticipation alone can keep you tense inside moments that were meant to be simple and nourishing. What troubled me most was how often this phrase appeared at emotional crossroads. People said it when they were desperate, tired, lonely, or overwhelmed, moments when the mind is especially suggestible. Those are the moments when language sinks deeper, when metaphors become beliefs, and beliefs quietly rewrite the rules you live by. I watched people convince themselves that love required suffering, that success demanded burnout, that peace was only temporary and always expensive. Their lives began to reflect those expectations, not because they were unlucky, but because their decisions were being guided by an internal story that said nothing good comes freely. Eventually, I stopped using the phrase entirely. Not because I was afraid of it, but because I could feel what it was teaching my body about worth, about ease, about what I believed I deserved. I realized I didn't want to live inside a story where every beautiful thing came with a hidden price tag, where rest felt suspicious, and where joy felt borrowed rather than belonging. And once I noticed that shift inside myself, I started hearing the phrase everywhere in conversations, captions, jokes, and recognizing how quietly it was shaping the emotional economy of the people who said it, long before they ever realized they were negotiating with their own well-being. This one, more than any other, carried a weight that people didn't notice they were handing over to the universe. It was usually said with a laugh that didn't quite reach the eyes, a resigned shrug after a small inconvenience, a way of venting without seeming dramatic. Bad things always happen to me. I said it too, countless times, often after a string of minor setbacks, missing the bus, spilling coffee on my favorite shirt, losing my train of thought in an important conversation. It seemed harmless, a reflexive way to explain frustration, to claim a narrative that felt understandable. But there is a strange power in habitual phrases, especially ones that signal expectation. Every time I repeated this sentence, I was training my mind to scan for misfortune, to interpret neutral events as proof of a pattern, to anticipate the next disappointment before it even arrived. My nervous system began to expect loss. My body braced for it in subtle ways, and my perception sharpened only toward problems. I started noticing every small setback and overlooking every smooth moment because the story I had told myself was more compelling than reality itself. It was easier to live inside the narrative of inevitable misfortune than to admit that life was unpredictable and sometimes generous. What made it insidious was how easily it disguised itself as humor or humility. People laughed and nodded, commiserating over shared stories of bad luck, unaware that every repetition was anchoring the expectation deeper. Over time, the phrase created a kind of energetic pattern, a rhythm that my life began to match almost automatically. Doors that could have opened quietly remained closed. Opportunities were missed because I anticipated them turning into complications. Relationships were sabotaged because I assumed inevitable heartbreak. It wasn't that I actively invited calamity, but the mind's attention is a powerful architect. When your energy is tuned to expect loss, you unconsciously move through the world in ways that align with that expectation. Tense postures, cautious choices, subtle self-sabotage, a hesitancy to trust or hope. I began noticing this everywhere. Friends who repeated it at every inconvenience, co-workers who introduced themselves with a long list of misfortunes, family members who described themselves as accident-prone or always unlucky. Their words framed the lens through which they interpreted every day. They didn't just predict bad things, they prepared for them, creating patterns in which misfortune became almost inevitable. The energy they carried was heavy, a constant vibration that shaped attention, choice, and response. Even when good things happened, it felt temporary or undeserved because the body had already rehearsed disappointment. And the haunting part was how quietly it operated. There was no explosion, no visible curse, no grand cosmic punishment, just small nudges that confirmed what I had already declared. A minor delay became proof of disaster, a miscommunication became proof of betrayal, a small failure became proof of a cursed trajectory. I watched over and over how people, myself included, unconsciously matched the rhythm of the phrase they had repeated most often. It was exhausting to live like that, but it felt familiar, like returning to a room you had spent years arranging in the exact shape of your fears. The sentence, "bad things always happen to me," wasn't just a joke or a complaint. It was a rehearsal, a quiet training, a spell cast without ceremony or intention, shaping life one repetition at a time. I hear it more than any other phrase, spoken like armor, like a declaration of strength, like the final line in a long story of frustration. I don't care anymore. People say it when they've been hurt, when they're tired, when they feel like they've given everything and gotten nothing in return. I said it too, many times, after heartbreaks that left me hollow, after friendships that burned too quickly, after opportunities that slipped through my fingers despite all the effort I'd poured in. At first, it felt liberating, a shield I could hold up against disappointment, a signal to the world that I was untouchable, that I had no more energy to invest in outcomes that might betray me. But like most phrases we repeat without reflection, it carried a gravity I didn't notice at the time. Saying it is not just a dismissal, it's a surrender. It quietly hands over authorship of your life to something else. The words themselves are a statement. I am no longer steering. I am no longer accountable. I am no longer present in my own narrative. What struck me over time was how much this phrase reshaped the interior landscape. When you say you don't care, even in jest, you are signaling to your own nervous system that investment is dangerous, that vulnerability is futile, that engagement is optional. Your body responds accordingly, drawing inward, tightening muscles, dulling emotional responsiveness, building walls that feel protective but also isolating. Relationships become tenuous because one party is absent, even if physically present. Opportunities are avoided because hesitation and detachment become reflexive. The world doesn't notice the phrase as much as you do, but your subconscious takes it seriously. It begins aligning your actions with the expectation that you will disengage, that you will withdraw, that you will give up before the moment even has a chance to unfold. I saw it mirrored everywhere around me. Friends who swore they didn't care, colleagues who shrugged at possibilities, lovers who claimed emotional detachment as a badge of honor. They were not invincible. They were rehearsing absence. Over time, their lives reflected it. Doors closed more easily, connections faded without effort, experiences remained shallow, and the richness of engagement slowly eroded. And yet, because the phrase feels protective, no one questions it at first. It feels like wisdom, a hard-earned defense mechanism. But beneath the surface, it quietly teaches resignation, creating a pattern of withdrawal that becomes familiar and comfortable, even if it is lonely. The most subtle danger is how contagious it can be, especially for those who repeat it during moments of emotional turbulence. When someone near you adopts this mantra, it shifts the energy in a room, lowers the collective expectation for engagement, and signals that it's acceptable to disengage. Even small acts of care or connection are met with distance because the model for interaction has been altered. Saying, "I don't care anymore," isn't just a reflection of frustration, it's a rehearsal of future behavior. It trains the mind to prioritize detachment over participation, numbness over feeling, avoidance over risk. The paradox is that people believe they are protecting themselves by saying it, when in reality they are quietly shaping lives that mirror detachment and absence, creating a slow drift into seasons they never fully intended to inhabit. Words are not mere sounds. They are not just echoes bouncing off walls or empty vessels meant to fill awkward silences. Words are energy, shapes, and instructions. They carry weight far beyond what the ear hears or the mind rationalizes. Every time we speak, we leave an imprint on ourselves, on the people around us, on the world we inhabit. What we joke about, what we casually vent, what we think is harmless repetition is quietly instructing the universe about how our lives should unfold. The sentences we toss into conversation like confetti are more than confetti. They are blueprints. They are tiny spells disguised in laughter, routines dressed as humor, incantations wrapped in frustration. And once released, once spoken, they begin their work long after our awareness has moved elsewhere. I have seen it countless times. People shrug, thinking words vanish once spoken, thinking no one hears the inner murmurs of self-doubt or fear, the casual curses we mutter about our luck or our worth. But they echo. They echo in the chambers of the mind, in the subtle chemistry of the body, in the rhythm of choices that follow. The mind does not distinguish between jest and intent when repetition is involved. The body does not question whether the statement is dramatic or sincere when it is rehearsed often enough. Energy responds, intention responds, the unseen world responds. And the strange, unnerving truth is that your future will align itself to the patterns you have fed for years without ever questioning them. Think of your words as seeds. Each phrase you toss into the air is a seed that takes root somewhere, whether in the fertile ground of your subconscious or in the invisible web of cause and effect around you. Some seeds bear fruit gently, in the form of small coincidences, serendipitous doors opening, moments of joy that feel earned. Other seeds grow thorns, entwining themselves around your perceptions, your choices, your expectations, until you cannot distinguish between reality and the structure your own speech has built. Do you realize how often you plant thorns instead of blossoms? How many times have you shrugged off a sentence only to see the world rearrange itself into the shape of that careless comment weeks, months, or years later? How many times have you unknowingly rehearsed your own limitations, narrated your own suffering, invited chaos disguised as habit, or surrendered your authorship in moments of frustration or exhaustion? I tell you this not to frighten, but to illuminate, to reveal that there is power in awareness and liberation in noticing what we have unconsciously unleashed. The words you speak, the sentences you repeat, the jokes you tell at your own expense, they are not neutral. They are active participants in the architecture of your life. They hold the capacity to construct, to shape, to attract, and to repel. And when you recognize this, you realize that responsibility does not rest with anyone else but you. The shape of your days, the texture of your relationships, the unfolding of your desires, all of it is influenced by what you choose to voice, what you rehearse, and what you permit yourself to believe aloud. So consider every casual statement, every repeated phrase, every just joking line with the weight it deserves. Listen to the echo of your own words in the chambers of your life. Watch how your language quietly sculpts your reality, how it bends circumstances toward expectation, how it opens or closes doors before you even know they existed. Words are not innocent. They are not disposable. They are alive. They remember. They respond. They carry far more authority than we willingly admit. And if you have been careless with them, if you have allowed the easy, the frustrated, or the joking sentence to define you, now is the moment to see it clearly, to trace its effects, to recognize what you have called into being without realizing it. The question you must face, the one that will not answer itself, is this: if your words have the power to shape your life so profoundly, what will you choose to speak next? How will you wield this subtle, relentless force? And which sentences will you allow to echo? And which will you finally stop from shaping the life you may not yet be ready to live? The answers wait not in theory or wishful thinking, but in the choices you make today, and in the careful, deliberate, and unflinching attention to every phrase you release into the air from this moment forward.